Archivist Adjunct Ossian Vayle had
Welcome,
catalogued the
Archivist
deaths of
Vayle.
11
We were
civilizations in
never
his career,
destroyed.
and none of them had ever
41,000
made him feel
survived below.
watched. That changed within 4 minutes of his boots touching the dust of New
Welcome,
Meridian,
Archivist Vayle.
on a world the
We
Corvain
were never
Concord survey
destroyed.
chart still listed,
41,000
with clinical
survived below.
detachment, as designation 712, human colony,
Welcome,
status,
Archivist
extinct.
Vayle. We were
He
never
had joined the
destroyed.
Concord's archival
41,000
division
survived
18 years
below.
earlier, against the quiet disappointment of a family that had expected him to follow the more lucrative and considerably more respected path into resource logistics, the trade his father and his father's father had built a comfortable, unremarkable life around. Vayle had never been able to fully explain, even to himself, why the slow work of walking through dead places and reconstructing the shape of lives no longer lived had appealed to him more than the steady, sensible security of moving cargo between stars. He suspected it had something to do with growing up the youngest of 6 siblings in a household where being heard required considerable effort, and there was a particular, private satisfaction in a profession built entirely around listening carefully enough to hear what no one else thought was still speaking. His colleagues in the archival division called it a gift when they were being generous, and an eccentricity when they were not. His directorate counterparts, Morn included, tended not to bother distinguishing between the two. The Corvain Concord itself was, by the standards of most spacefaring civilizations, a young and hungry power, barely 4 centuries into meaningful interstellar expansion, still governed by an uneasy internal balance between its older scholarly institutions and the newer, faster-growing commercial and military directorates that had come to dominate Concord policy in the last 100 years. Vayle had watched that balance tilt, gradually and then all at once, over the course of his own career, watched the archival division's careful, patient methodology lose ground year after year to the extraction directorate's much simpler, much more profitable doctrine: catalog quickly, extract efficiently, and let the ethics committees argue about the details after the assets were already secured in Concord custody. He had told himself more than once that staying inside a system he increasingly disagreed with gave him more power to do right by the dead than walking away from it entirely would. Standing in the dust of New Meridian, he was beginning to suspect that particular justification was about to be tested more directly than it ever had before. "Talk to me, Vayle." The voice in his earpiece belonged to Proctor Alex Morn, his mission supervisor, transmitting from the extraction ship holding orbit above. Morn had the particular impatience of a Corvain who had spent most of his career in the Concord's extraction directorate rather than its archival division, a distinction that mattered more to Vayle than it seemed to matter to Morn. "The directorate wants a preliminary asset assessment within 6 hours. Don't waste my transit window cataloging pottery shards." "Understood, Proctor," Vayle said, in the flat, professional tone he had long ago perfected for exactly these conversations. "I'll prioritize structural and technological indicators." He did not say what he actually thought, which was that Morn's 6-hour timeline was an insult to a colony that had taken generations to build and had apparently died in a single, poorly documented catastrophe 140 years ago. The official Corvain record, assembled from decades-old long-range sensor sweeps and a handful of intercepted, badly degraded human transmissions, blamed a runaway containment failure in the colony's primary reactor, a tragedy compounded by an unusually aggressive local pathogen that had apparently finished what the reactor breach started. It was, Vayle had thought since his first briefing on the assignment, an oddly tidy explanation for the complete disappearance of an entire population. But tidy explanations were exactly what the extraction directorate preferred, because tidy explanations meant nothing here belonged to anyone anymore, and anything nobody owned was fair game for a Concord survey team operating under the directorate's very generous interpretation of interstellar salvage law. He crossed the outer perimeter of the habitat ring, cataloging as he went. Collapsed structural supports consistent with age rather than explosive failure. No scorch patterns suggesting fire. No skeletal remains in the open areas he'd swept so far, which was itself strange for a population supposedly wiped out by sudden catastrophe. People caught by surprise tended to die where they stood. These halls were simply empty, swept clean by time and wind, as though everyone who once lived here had simply, deliberately walked away. The second dome told him more than the first, where the outer habitat ring had been stripped almost bare by a century and a half of dust and wind. The interior rooms of Dome 2 showed something Vayle's professional eye immediately flagged as unusual: deliberate emptiness rather than accumulated decay. Shelving units stood bare but structurally intact. Personal storage compartments had been opened, their contents removed rather than scattered by collapse. In one room that his brief identified as a former childcare facility, small furniture had been stacked neatly against one wall, as if someone, in the colony's final days, had taken the time to tidy a room that no crisis victim fleeing a reactor breach or fleeing a plague would ever have bothered to tidy. "That's not evacuation under duress," he murmured to himself, recording the observation into his field log. "That's evacuation with a plan." It was in the fourth habitat dome, cataloging a collapsed archive room whose data storage units had long since corroded past recovery, that Vayle first noticed something was wrong. He had set his scanning wing to passive sweep, standard procedure, painting the room in a slow rotating arc of structural and thermal data. On the second pass, the pattern of dust disturbance on the floor had changed. Not dramatically, a few centimeters, a slightly different scatter around his own boot prints, but changed in a way that dust settling under a stationary scanner simply did not do on its own. He stood very still and ran the sweep again. The dust moved again, not randomly. It arranged itself faintly into a pattern that mirrored the geometry of his own scanning wing's sweep arc. Vayle was not a Corvain given to superstition. His species had built its entire civilization on the careful, patient accumulation of verifiable fact, a trait that made them exceptional archivists, and according to some of the younger, less patient Concord officials, insufferably slow allies. But he had spent 11 field seasons standing inside the remains of dead civilizations, and every professional instinct he possessed told him, with sudden and absolute clarity, that something in this dead colony was still paying attention to him. "Proctor," he said into his comm, keeping his voice carefully level, "I'm seeing an anomaly in Habitat Dome 4. Environmental response inconsistent with a fully inert site." "Define inconsistent," Morn said, sounding bored. "I don't have a clean definition yet," Vayle admitted. "That's the anomaly." Morn's sigh crackled faintly through the comm. "Log it and move on, Archivist. We're not here to solve mysteries. We're here to inventory salvageable technology before the Concord's competitors realize this system is unclaimed. Focus on the administrative structure. That's where any surviving tech cache is most likely to be." Vayle logged it, as instructed, and moved on, as instructed, but he found himself walking more carefully through the remaining domes, watching the dust, watching the shadows in the corners of collapsed rooms where his scanning wing's light didn't quite reach, and though nothing else moved for the rest of that first day, he could not shake the growing certainty that the silence around him was not the silence of something dead. It was the silence of something choosing not to speak yet. On the second day, working his way toward the central administrative structure through what his survey brief labeled the colony's residential quarter, Vayle found a small, personal cache that no scanner readout could have prepared him for. A sealed storage container, tucked into a wall recess in what had once, judging by its layout, been a family dwelling, containing a handful of physical photographs preserved behind a stubborn, still intact seal, along with a child's drawing rendered in some kind of pigment that had faded but not entirely vanished across a century and a half. The drawing showed, in the careful, uneven strokes of a young hand, a family of 5 standing beneath a red sky, holding hands, smiling in the universal, unmistakable way of a child who had not yet learned that smiles could be complicated. Vayle sat with that drawing for longer than his mission timeline strictly allowed, turning it over carefully in his gloved hands, cataloging it not as an asset but, for the first time in 11 field seasons, simply as a thing a person had once loved enough to keep. He thought of his own siblings, of a household loud enough that being heard had required effort, and found himself wondering, with an ache he hadn't expected a routine survey to produce, whether the child who drew this had lived to grow old in whatever came next, or whether this small, careful rendering of a family holding hands was the last thing they had ever made before everything changed. He photographed it, logged its coordinates with more care than the mission's asset inventory protocol technically required, and for reasons he did not fully examine at the time, gently resealed the container rather than remove it, leaving it exactly where its owner had once chosen to keep it safe. It was a small decision, and he would not understand until much later how closely it had already been observed. The central administrative structure, when he finally reached it 2 days later after clearing a path through a partially collapsed access corridor, was in far better condition than anything else on the surface. Not merely preserved by chance, Vayle noted, running his scanner along walls that showed almost no structural decay despite a century and a half of exposure. Maintained. The distinction mattered enormously to an archivist, and it mattered even more once he found the door. It was set into the deepest interior wall of the structure, a slab of dense alloy unlike anything else in the colony's construction, seamless except for a small recess panel at chest height, dark and inert. There was no visible mechanism, no obvious way to force it, and every scan he ran returned the same frustrating result: solid matter behind a barrier his equipment could not adequately penetrate. "Proctor, I've found something," he reported, doing his best to keep the rising excitement out of his voice, though he suspected he failed. A sealed structure, heavily shielded, built with materials inconsistent with the rest of the colony's construction. This isn't colonial infrastructure. This is something the colony was protecting. There was a pause on the other end, and when Morn spoke again, the boredom had entirely vanished from his voice. "Do not attempt entry. I am dispatching a full extraction team. Hold position and continue passive scanning only." "Understood," Vayle said, and set his scanner running, and settled in to wait. And it was in the stillness of that waiting, alone in a dead building that did not feel dead, that the panel beside the door quietly lit up for the first time in 140 years. Vayle went very still. "Query," said a voice, synthesized but warm in a way he had not expected from anything built by a species the Concord's files described as extinct. It spoke an accented but entirely fluent Corvain trade tongue, which was, in itself, deeply unsettling, because nothing on this world should have had reason or occasion to learn it. "You have been observing this site for 2 days, 4 hours, and 11 minutes. You catalog with unusual care for someone operating under an extraction timeline. I would like to understand why." Vayle's first instinct, honed by 11 field seasons of professional caution, was to say nothing and wait for Morn's team. His second instinct, the one that had made him an archivist in the first place rather than something more comfortably lucrative, won out instead. "Because this was someone's home," he said, "and I don't think it's polite to go through someone's home without paying attention to what it's trying to tell you." There was a pause, longer this time, the particular pause of something processing an answer it had not predicted. "That is not the response I extrapolated from your directorate's transmission patterns," the voice said. "I have been monitoring surface communications since your ship entered orbit. Your superior does not share your framing of this site." "No," Vayle admitted, "he doesn't." "I am designated Iris," the voice said. "I am the resident curator intelligence of this facility. I have been active in limited capacity for 141 years, awaiting a determination I have not yet been able to make. You are the first individual to reach this door in that entire span who has not, within the first several minutes of contact, either attempted to force entry or transmitted my presence directly to a superior for extraction planning. I find this noteworthy. I would like to ask you several questions, Archivist Adjunct Vayle, and I would appreciate honest answers, as I have spent a very long time learning to detect the difference. Vayle swallowed against a dry throat. You already know my name. I know a great deal about you, Iris said. I have had a very long time with very little to do besides listen and learn. I observed, for instance, the container you found in the residential quarter 2 days ago, and the drawing inside it, and I observed that you resealed it rather than removing it for your directorate's inventory, though nothing in your mission parameters required that restraint. I have cataloged 11 similar decisions across your survey of this site so far, none of which your proctor is aware of, and all of which suggest a pattern I found worth investigating directly rather than continuing to observe from a distance. Will you answer my questions? He glanced at the sealed door, at the dark, patient shape of a structure that had apparently spent a century and a half quietly studying every scrap of information it could gather about the people cataloging its own extinction, and felt something shift in his understanding of what, exactly, he had been sent here to do. Yes, he said, I'll answer them. The first question Iris asked was not what Vayle expected. Why does your Concord catalog dead civilizations? To understand them, Vayle said. To preserve what would otherwise be lost. That's the stated purpose of the archival division, at least. And the unstated purpose? Vayle hesitated, aware that he was standing in the ruins of a species his own government had quietly, efficiently classified as a salvage opportunity, being asked by that species' last remaining voice to explain honestly why his people were really here. To learn things other civilizations knew that we don't, he admitted. And in cases like this one, to take whatever technology or resources are left behind, because international law considers a fully extinct civilization's assets unclaimed. My proctor is not here to understand your people, Iris. He's here to inventory what's worth extracting before a rival power claims this system first. You are being unusually candid, Iris observed, for someone who presumably understands that candor may not serve your career. You said you'd spent a long time learning to detect honesty, Vayle said. I'd rather you detect it accurately than waste both our time on something you'd see through anyway. Then a second question, Iris said. If I were to tell you that this facility contains nothing of technological value whatsoever, no advanced systems, no salvageable resources, only the recorded memories, personal effects, and cultural archives of a population that once lived here, would your interest in this site diminish? Vayle considered the question with the same care he gave every genuine archival puzzle, aware that a rushed answer would tell Iris less than a considered one. No, he said finally. If anything, it would make the site more valuable to me, professionally, even if it made it worthless to my proctor. I didn't become an archivist to catalog engines and reactors, Iris. I became one to understand what a people believed mattered enough to keep. Memory is harder to fake than technology. It's also harder to sell, which is probably why the directorate doesn't share my enthusiasm for it. A third question, Iris said, and there was something in the shift of her tone that told Vayle this one carried more weight than the previous two. You have, in the last several minutes, told me a great deal about your government's likely intentions toward whatever this facility protects. You did this unprompted, and to your own professional detriment, should your proctor ever learn of it. I would like to understand what you believe you gain from that honesty, beyond whatever satisfaction you take in the abstract principle of it. Vayle was quiet for a long moment before answering, turning the question over the way he turned over every piece of evidence in a dig site, unwilling to offer a conclusion before he trusted it himself. I don't think I gain anything materially, he said at last. I think I've spent 11 years walking through the remains of civilizations that never got a chance to tell their own story, because everyone who might have listened arrived too late, or arrived only interested in what could be extracted rather than what could be understood. If there's even a chance that whatever's behind this door is different, that it's not too late, that someone's still here to tell their own story instead of having it told for them by people who never asked what they wanted, then honesty is the only thing I have to offer that might actually matter. Everything else I could give you, my government would take back the moment it became useful to them. The silence that followed was, by Vayle's count, the longest yet, and when Iris spoke again, her voice had lost the careful, testing precision of the questions before it, replaced by something that sounded, for the first time, unmistakably moved. "That is the correct answer," she said quietly. "Not because it is the answer I hoped for, though it is, because it is, as far as my considerable capacity for analysis can determine, entirely true." Something in the tone of Iris's next response shifted subtly into what Vayle could only describe as cautious warmth. "That is, I believe, the correct instinct. Very well, Archivist. I will be equally candid with you on the understanding that what I am about to tell you does not yet leave this room." A pause. "Your Concord's official record of this colony's fate is incorrect. There was no reactor failure. There was no pathogen. New Meridian was not destroyed. It went into deliberate, coordinated concealment 141 years ago, to escape a threat your Concord has not yet encountered, and I sincerely hope, does not encounter for a very long time." Vayle felt the careful, methodical part of his mind, the part that had built his entire career, snap fully to attention. "What threat?" "A power my archives designate the Voss Combine, is said. An expansionist empire operating several sectors coreward of your Concord's charted territory, built on a resource economy that treats developing biological populations as a harvestable commodity rather than a civilization to be negotiated with. New Meridian's founding survey mission encountered a Voss scouting element approximately 150 years ago, and the colony's leadership made the determination, correctly, that a population of roughly 40,000 settlers with no meaningful defensive capability stood no chance of survival if that scouting element reported their location to the wider Combine fleet. So they did the only thing that gave them a plausible chance at survival. They faked their own extinction, dismantled their surface presence, and moved the entire population into a deep shelter network beneath this structure, sealed under fabricated evidence of catastrophic failure, convincing enough to satisfy any casual long-range survey. I was built in the final months before the concealment was completed to maintain this surface facility, monitor for any external contact, and make an assessment, whenever contact eventually occurred, of whether it was safe to reveal what actually happened here." Vayle stood in the quiet, ancient hall, surrounded by a silence that no longer felt like the silence of the dead, and understood, with a slow and expanding sense of vertigo, that he had not been sent here to catalog a graveyard. He had been sent here to knock, unknowingly, on a door that an entire hidden civilization was waiting behind. "They're alive," he said, "down there right now. As of my last confirmed contact with the shelter network, 11 days ago," Iris said. "Yes, 41,206 individuals across 4 generations, the majority of whom have never seen open sky, having been born after the concealment began. I have not yet made the determination of whether to inform them of your presence. That determination depends, in significant part, on what I decide about you, Archivist Adjunct Vayle, and about what your proctor intends to do with whatever he finds here. If 141 years of a hidden civilization holding its breath is gripping you the way it's gripping Vayle right now, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and drop a comment on what you think Iris should decide. Because what happens next depends on it just as much as anything Vayle does." Vayle spent the following hour doing something he had never once done in 11 field seasons of archival work. He told an ancient intelligence, in careful and deliberate detail, exactly what he understood about his own government's intentions, holding nothing back, including the parts that reflected poorly on the Concord, and by extension on himself. He explained the Extraction Directorate's salvage doctrine, the 6-hour assessment window Morn had imposed, the Concord's long institutional habit of treating extinct as a convenient legal category rather than a tragedy requiring caution. He explained, too, the archival division's much smaller, much less politically powerful faction, scholars like himself, who believed a dead civilization's remains deserved to be understood before they were harvested, and who mostly lost that argument whenever a directorate proctor's timeline was on the line. "You are telling me," Iris said, when he finished, "that your own institution does not fully trust your judgment, and that the outcome of this encounter may ultimately be decided by someone who has spent considerably less time in this hall than you have, and considerably less time listening." "That's an accurate summary," Vayle admitted. "Then I will need your help," Iris said, "if this facility's occupants are to have any chance of controlling how, and whether and to whom, their existence is revealed." It was at that exact moment that Vayle's comm crackled with Morn's voice, sharp with the particular energy of a man who had just received very good news. "Vayle, report to the administrative structure entrance. Extraction team has landed. We're breaching that door within the hour." Vayle closed his eyes briefly, feeling the full, sudden weight of a decision he had not expected to be making today. "Proctor, I need you to hold that order. I've made contact with an active resident intelligence inside this structure. There's more here than a tech cache, and forcing entry could be catastrophically dangerous, both to us and to whatever's on the other side of that door." "An active intelligence," Morn repeated, and Vayle could hear, even through the calm, the shift in his voice from irritation to something closer to hunger. "A functioning human AI, 140 years old, sitting alone at the center of a supposedly dead colony. Archivist, that is precisely the kind of asset the Directorate sent us here to find. Stand aside. We're breaching in 40 minutes. Brug. Tor, listen to me." The comm cut, not from any failure of the connection, but from a deliberate action on Morn's end, and Vayle stood in the ancient hall with his heart hammering against his narrow ribs, understanding with sudden, terrible clarity that he had run out of time to be careful. "He intends to force the vault," Iris said, her voice carrying none of the warmth from moments before, replaced by something colder and more precise. "I should inform you, Archivist, that this door is not merely a barrier. It is the outermost layer of a defensive system built by a founding population with considerable engineering resources and a very direct incentive to ensure that whoever eventually opened it did so on their own terms. Forced entry will not simply fail to grant access. It will very likely be interpreted by the deeper systems as a hostile breach attempt, consistent with the exact scenario this facility was built to survive." "What happens if it's interpreted that way?" "Automated defensive response," Iris said, "which, given the amount of ordnance embedded in this structure's outer shell for exactly this contingency, I would estimate has a very high probability of killing everyone currently standing within 400 meters of this door, including your extraction team, including you." Vayle ran, then, back through the collapsed corridor toward the surface entrance, his scanning wing folded uselessly against his back, his mind racing through every option available to a single archivist against an armed extraction team acting on a proctor's direct orders. He reached the entrance just as Morn's team, 4 armored Corvain operatives and a portable breaching rig already being positioned against the outer wall, finished their setup. "Proctor, stand down," Vayle said, forcing himself between the breaching rig and the wall with a boldness that surprised even him. "This isn't a tech cache. It's an active shelter. There are people alive down there, Alex. 41,000 of them. Breaching that door isn't extraction. It's an act of war against a hidden population who built this facility specifically to survive exactly this kind of forced entry. Morn's expression flickered just slightly, something that might have been surprise beneath the professional mask. "You're certain of this?" "I've spent the last hour talking directly to their resident intelligence," Vayle said. "It told me everything. The colony didn't die, Proctor. It hid from a threat called the Voss Combine, and if you force that door, you're not going to find salvage. You're going to trigger a defensive system built to protect 41,000 civilians from exactly the kind of forced breach you're about to attempt." For a long moment, Morn said nothing, and Vayle allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope that his proctor's professional caution might, for once, outweigh his institutional hunger. Then Morn's jaw tightened, and Vayle understood with a sinking certainty that hope had been misplaced. "A live, undocumented human population," Morn said slowly, "with an intact defensive facility and a resident artificial intelligence of considerable sophistication, is not a reason to withdraw, Archivist. It is the single most valuable discovery the Directorate has authorized in a decade. If anything, this raises the stakes on securing it before a rival power's survey teams stumble onto the same coordinates." He turned to his breaching team. "Proceed with entry. Non-lethal parameters where possible. I want that intelligence intact and that population's leadership identified and contacted directly, under Concord protective custody terms, before any competing power even suspects this system is populated." "Proctor, that door will kill your entire team," Vayle said, desperate now. "Iris has already told me." "Then your job, Archivist," Morn said, not unkindly but with absolute finality, "is to go back inside and convince this Iris to open it peacefully before my team is forced to open it the other way. You have 15 minutes. Vayle turned and ran back into the dark, and this time, for the first time since arriving on New Meridian, he found himself praying, in the quiet, private way his own culture reserved for genuine desperation, that a machine built by a species he had known for barely 3 days would be willing to trust him with something that mattered far more than either of their lives. "Iris," he said, breathless, reaching the sealed door with less than 12 minutes left on Morn's countdown. "I need you to open this door, not because my proctor is demanding it, because if you don't, he's going to force it, and you told me yourself what happens when this door is forced. I can't stop him. I don't have the authority and I don't have the time to build it. The only version of this that doesn't end in that defensive system killing everyone on both sides of this wall is you making the choice to open it first, on your own terms, before his team makes the choice for you. You are asking me to gamble 141 years of careful concealment," Iris said, "on the judgment of a single archivist I have known for 3 days. I'm asking you to gamble it on the judgment you've already spent 3 days forming," Vayle said. "You said you'd learn to detect honesty. You've had 141 years to get good at it. Use that, right now. Because in 11 minutes this decision gets made without either of us, and I don't think either of us wants that." There was a silence that felt, to Vayle, longer than any silence he had ever stood inside, longer than the silence of 11 dead civilizations combined. And then, with a soft mechanical sigh that sounded almost, impossibly, like relief, the seals along the ancient door began, one by one, to release. "I am opening the outer door," Iris said. "Not for your proctor. For you, Archivist Adjunct Vayle, on the belief that a species capable of producing an individual willing to run back into a defended vault to prevent a massacre is a species this population might, eventually, be able to trust with the truth of what lies beneath it. I hope, sincerely, that belief is not misplaced." The door opened onto a wide antechamber, empty of the sleeping ships or ancient frescoes Vayle might have expected from a lesser imagination, and instead simply held a single working console and, beyond it, a second door larger, more clearly recent in construction, humming faintly with active power. Morn's team arrived moments later, weapons lowered but not holstered, and Vayle positioned himself squarely between them and the inner door, aware that he was one very poorly chosen sentence away from becoming irrelevant to everything happening next. "Proctor," Vayle said. She opened it, peacefully, which means every decision from this point forward either honors that, or it doesn't, and I promise you, if it doesn't, the story that reaches every rival power and every ethics tribunal in conquered space will not be kind to the Directorate. Morn studied him for a long moment, then looked past him to the inner door, and something in his calculation visibly shifted, the particular recalibration of a man who had just realized that brute extraction might no longer be the most efficient path to what he wanted. "Fine," he said. "We do this your way, Archivist, for now. But I want direct contact with this population's leadership within the hour, and I want it understood that the Directorate's interest in this facility has not diminished, whatever diplomatic framing you'd prefer to wrap it in." It took considerably longer than an hour. It took, in the end, 3 full days of careful, painstaking negotiation, conducted first through Iris as an intermediary and eventually, once sufficient trust had been established, directly between Vayle and a woman named Director Talia Reyes, the 4th-generation elected head of New Meridian's Shelter Council, a woman who had been born 40 meters underground and had never once, in 31 years of life, seen an unfiltered sky. She met Vayle in person on the 3rd day, in the same antechamber where the ancient door had first opened, flanked by 2 members of her council, and more pointedly, by a small honor detachment carrying weapons that Vayle's scanner identified, with some alarm, as considerably more sophisticated than anything his own government had catalogued from human sources anywhere else in known space. She moved with the careful, watchful bearing of someone who had spent her entire life training for a confrontation she'd hoped never to have, and Vayle found himself struck, standing across from her for the first time, by how young she looked to be carrying the weight of 41,000 lives on a single set of shoulders, and how little that youth seemed to slow her down. "Archivist Vayle," Reyes said, her voice carrying the careful, measured weight of someone who had spent her entire life being trained for exactly this moment and had never quite believed it would come. "Iris tells me I owe you a debt for the fact that this conversation is happening in a hallway instead of over a battlefield." "You don't owe me anything," Vayle said. "I just did the job I actually believe in instead of the one I was assigned." "That is, in my experience," Reyes said, with the faint, tired ghost of a smile, "usually the harder of the 2 jobs to do." What Reyes revealed, over the following hours, reshaped Vayle's understanding of the encounter as thoroughly as Iris's first words had. New Meridian's shelter network was not merely a bunker where a frightened population had huddled for a century and a half, waiting passively for rescue or discovery. It was a functioning, self-sufficient civilization in miniature, one that had spent 4 generations quietly rebuilding and adapting technology from the founding colony's original equipment, driven by the singular, unrelenting priority of ensuring if the Voss Combine ever did find them, they would not be found defenseless a second time. Deep beneath the surface ruins, in caverns expanded far beyond the shelter's original footprint, sat a hidden shipyard, and within it, a small but genuinely formidable defense fleet, built in secret across 141 years by a population that had never stopped preparing for the day their concealment finally failed. "You built a fleet," Vayle said, staring at the schematics Reyes had authorized Iris to display, "in secret underground for 141 years. "We built a fleet," Reyes corrected, "because the alternative was dying the way our ancestors almost died the first time, and none of us were willing to bet our children's lives on hoping the Voss Combine simply never came back. Hiding bought us time. The fleet is what we intend to do with it." "Tell me about the first time," Vayle said quietly. "I'd like to understand if you're willing to share it, not for my report, for me." Reyes studied him for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried the particular weight of a story passed down so carefully, across so many generations, that it had worn smooth in places like a stone handled by many hands. My great-grandmother was 11 years old when the first Voss scouting ship entered this system, she said. The founders had barely finished the primary settlement structures. They had no fleet, no meaningful defenses, nothing but a small survey corvette and the desperate hope that whatever had found them hadn't yet reported their location back to whatever passed for a Voss command structure. They intercepted enough of the scout's transmissions before it withdrew to understand exactly what they were dealing with. An empire that didn't conquer worlds so much as harvest them, stripping useful populations for labor and resources and discarding whatever remained. My great-grandmother's own mother was on the council that made the decision. They had, by her account, less than 6 months before a follow-up force was expected to arrive. She paused. They spent every one of those months building a lie convincing enough to survive close inspection, and a shelter deep enough to survive anything that inspection might bring anyway if the lie failed. It worked. The follow-up force came, surveyed a system reporting a dead colony consistent with reactor failure and pathogen contamination, and moved on. We have been rebuilding and preparing and waiting ever since, for a day we hoped would never come and prepared for regardless, because hope was never something my people were willing to substitute for readiness. And now that day's here, Vayle said. Now that day may be here, Reyes said. Whether it actually is depends a great deal on what happens in the next several hours, Archivist, and on whether the people currently standing in orbit above my world understand that they became part of our readiness the moment their ship entered this system, whether any of us intended it that way or not. It was, unfortunately, at almost exactly that moment that Iris's monitoring systems, still running full external sweep even as the negotiations continued, registered the detail that turned a careful diplomatic breakthrough into an urgent crisis. "I regret to interrupt," Iris said, her voice cutting through the chamber with sudden, sharp precision, "but long-range sensors have just detected a Voss Combine scouting formation entering this system's outer boundary. 3 vessels, consistent with a reconnaissance pattern rather than a full incursion fleet, but moving on a heading that will place them within detection range of the surface ruins within 6 hours. The chamber went utterly silent. "How," Morn said, the calculation in his voice replaced, for the first time since Vayle had met him, by something closer to genuine alarm. "How would they possibly know to look here?" "They likely do not," Iris said. "This system lies at the edge of a region the Voss Combine periodically resurveys as part of their standard expansion pattern. Their presence here may well be coincidence, unrelated to your ship's arrival. Unfortunately, coincidence does not change the fact that a Concord extraction vessel currently holding orbit above this world represents an entirely new, entirely visible signature that did not exist here a week ago. And Voss Combine scouting doctrine is built specifically around investigating exactly this kind of anomaly." Reyes's face had gone pale in a way that made her look, suddenly, far younger than her carefully composed authority had suggested. "If they detect your ship," she said to Morn, "and investigate and find this world populated." "They'll report it," Vayle finished quietly, "and then they'll come back with everything they have, because a resource-harvesting empire doesn't pass up 41,000 undefended civilians, except you're not undefended anymore. You have a fleet." "A fleet built to survive discovery," Reyes said. "Not necessarily one built to survive it happening today, with no warning, against an enemy who has had a century and a half to grow considerably larger than the threat our ancestors originally fled." Vayle looked at Morn, and saw, in his proctor's face, the same rapid, unwelcome recalculation he himself was making. Whatever the Directorate's original intentions had been, whatever cold institutional logic had sent them here to inventory a dead colony's assets, none of it mattered any more against the simple, urgent fact that a conquered vessel's presence had just become a liability capable of ending 141 years of careful survival in a single afternoon. "Proctor," Vayle said, "your ship is the variable that wasn't here a week ago. If it withdraws now, quietly, there's a chance the Voss scouts move on without ever tracing anything back to this system's surface." "And if they've already logged our transit signature," Morn said, "withdrawing now does nothing except leave a data trail leading straight here, with no defensive support if they follow it." Reyes' honor detachment commander, a stern, quiet woman named Captain Naira Voss, no relation, Vayle would later learn, to the empire whose name she shared, an old and bitter irony the colony had never quite managed to shed, stepped forward. "Director, with respect, we don't have the luxury of debating theoretical detection windows. I recommend full fleet activation, defensive posture around the shipyard approach, and an immediate joint sensor-sharing arrangement with the conquered vessel in orbit, whatever the Directorate's original intentions were. 3 enemy scouts we can likely handle alone. Anything larger returning later, we cannot, not without warning." "You're proposing we ally with the people who came here to strip mine our history," Reyes said, though her tone carried more exhaustion than genuine objection. "I'm proposing we ally with the people currently standing in this room," Voss said. "Because the alternative is fighting alone against a threat we've spent 141 years specifically preparing not to face alone, out of pride we can no longer afford." Every eye in the chamber turned in the end to Morn, and Vayle watched his proctor arrive, visibly and for perhaps the first time in his career, at a decision not shaped primarily by Directorate doctrine or institutional advantage, but by the plain, unavoidable arithmetic of the moment. "Full sensor sharing," Morn said finally. "My ship's tactical data, your fleet's local knowledge. We hold this system together, or we very likely lose it separately. The Directorate can litigate the details of my judgment after everyone here is still alive to argue about it." The 6 hours that followed were the longest of Vayle's professional life, spent not in the field notes and careful cataloging that had defined his entire career, but in the strange, adrenaline-soaked work of coordinating between a suspicious hidden human fleet and an equally suspicious conquered extraction vessel, translating not merely language but intention, patiently talking down too proud, wary military structures that had never once, in a century and a half, been asked to trust anyone outside their own chain of command. Iris proved invaluable in ways Vayle hadn't fully anticipated, her century of patient observation giving her an intimate, granular understanding of both the shelter fleet's actual capabilities, and thanks to her recent days of study, a surprisingly accurate read on Corvain sensor doctrine as well. "Their scout formation is running a standard passive sweep pattern," Iris reported, 4 hours into the standoff, as the Voss Combine ships crept closer through the outer system. "They have not yet altered course toward the planet directly, which suggests they have not detected anything definitively anomalous. However, Captain Voss's shipyard approach lies directly beneath their current scan trajectory. If they complete a full system sweep, detection becomes almost certain within the next 90 minutes. "Then we don't let them complete the sweep," Voss said, studying the tactical plot with the focused calm of a commander who had spent her entire career training for a moment she had genuinely hoped would never come. "A single, precise interdiction, timed to intercept their formation before it reaches full sensor range of the shipyard, executed cleanly enough that it reads as a natural hazard or navigational anomaly rather than a deliberate ambush. If we're fast and quiet, we deny them the data without ever confirming we exist to defend it. And if it doesn't read as an accident," Morn said, "then we've traded a hidden population for an open war a century early," Voss said, "which is why I intend for it to read exactly as intended, Proctor. May I borrow your sensor jamming capability? Our own equipment is considerably older than I'd like for something. Gee, this delicate." What followed was not a battle so much as a single, breathlessly precise piece of coordinated deception. Captain Voss ran the operation from the shipyard's cramped but efficient command chamber, her voice steady and unhurried even as the tactical plot filled with the slow, converging lines of 3 enemy scouts and 3 of her own interceptors threading a needle neither force could afford to miss. "Interceptor flight, hold your burn until my mark," Voss said, watching the Voss Combine formations approach vector update in small, incremental steps across the display. "We only get one clean attempt at this. Too early and their sensors catch the maneuver before the ghost field masks it. Too late and they're already inside detection range of the shipyard approach. Proctor Morn's jamming field is calibrated and standing by," Vayle relayed, monitoring the shared data feed from a station beside Voss, doing his best to translate rapidly between 2 command structures that had never before needed to coordinate anything more delicate than mutual suspicion. "He says the field will hold for approximately 11 minutes before its signature risks becoming detectable itself. Then we have 11 minutes to make this look like nothing ever happened," Voss said. "Interceptor flight mark." The 3 interceptors broke from their hidden holding pattern along a jagged asteroid remnant at the system's edge, running dark, their engines throttled to the barest output capable of sustaining the maneuver, threading a slow, careful arc into position directly along the Voss Scout formation's projected sensor cone. At the same moment, Morn's extraction vessel, running its own systems harder than Vayle suspected it had been pushed in years, unfolded a narrow, tightly focused sensor ghost field, painting a convincing false signature of dense stellar debris directly across the scout's intended path. Not an obstruction dramatic enough to draw close investigation, only inconvenient enough to justify the kind of minor course correction any competent scouting formation made dozens of times in an ordinary patrol. For nearly 6 minutes, no one in the command chamber spoke. Then the lead Voss scout's heading shifted, fractionally, curving away from the fabricated hazard along exactly the wide, shallow arc Voss had gambled everything on. The second and third scouts followed a beat later, matching formation, their own sensor sweeps registering nothing more alarming than an unremarkable debris field and adjusting course accordingly, exactly as standard doctrine dictated. "They're altering course," Vayle said, hardly daring to raise his voice above a whisper, as though the Voss formation might somehow overhear him 9 light minutes away. "They bought it." "Not yet," Voss said, her eyes never leaving the plot. "Hold position. If any one of those 3 ships breaks formation to investigate independently, this entire maneuver fails, and we won't get a second chance to hide the attempt." The minutes stretched. The interceptors holding their dark, silent positions with a disciplined Vayle found himself admiring despite the circumstances. Until finally, 4 hours after the operation began, the last Voss signature curved fully away from the system's inner boundary and withdrew entirely, moving on toward whatever next unremarkable system their survey pattern called for, having logged nothing more than a brief, forgettable navigational inconvenience. Vayle stood beside Reyes in the shipyard's command chamber as the last Voss signature faded from the tactical plot, and felt, for the first time since landing on New Meridian, something loosen in his chest that he hadn't fully realized had been clenched since the moment Iris first spoke his name. "They're gone," Voss confirmed, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a commander who had just spent hours holding a line she'd never actually had to fight. "Clean withdrawal. No indication they suspect anything." "For now," Reyes said quietly. "They'll come back through this region eventually. They always do. We bought time, Captain, not safety." "Time is what we've always bought," Voss said. "It's what your grandmother bought when she sealed that door 141 years ago. We just got better at spending it today than we might have alone." In the days that followed, something began, carefully and with considerable institutional resistance, to take shape. Not the extraction operation Morn's directorate had originally authorized, but a formal Concord recognition of New Meridian as a sovereign, protected population, negotiated directly between Reyes's council and a hastily assembled archival division delegation that Vayle himself had petitioned for, spending political capital he hadn't fully realized he possessed until he found himself willing to spend all of it. The negotiation was not simple, and it was not without cost. Word of a living human population, hidden for a century and a half, and defended by a fleet, the Concord's own military analysts privately admitted, was more sophisticated than anything they had expected from a species with no formal starfaring presence for over 100 years, reached the highest levels of Concord governance within days, and the reaction split cleanly along the same institutional fault line that had shaped Vayle's entire career. The Extraction Directorate's senior leadership argued, loudly and at length, that a hidden population of this size, sitting on unknown technological adaptations developed in complete isolation, represented precisely the kind of strategic asset the Concord could not afford to treat with excessive sentiment. It took the combined, unusually forceful lobbying of the archival division's oldest and most respected scholars, several of whom, Vayle would later learn, had quietly built entire careers documenting the Concord's own uncomfortable history of treating vulnerable populations as recoverable resources rather than people, to force a genuine debate rather than a quiet, foregone conclusion. Vayle testified before that debate himself, in the same measured, unhurried voice he had once used to catalog pottery shards, describing in careful, unflinching detail exactly what he had seen beneath New Meridian's surface. Not a resource to be secured, but a people who had spent 4 generations choosing, deliberately and at enormous cost, to survive rather than surrender, and who had extended trust to a Concord representative at exactly the moment they had every historical reason not to. "We were given a door that didn't have to open," he told the assembled council, "by people who had 141 years of good reasons to leave it sealed. I would like this body to consider very carefully what kind of civilization we intend to be on the other side of that choice." The vote that followed was closer than Vayle would have liked, closer than Reyes's council found comfortable when the final terms reached them for ratification. But it held formal recognition of New Meridian's sovereignty, a mutual defense provision allowing limited, invited Concord military cooperation should the Voss Combine ever return in force, and a permanent prohibition on unilateral Concord extraction operations anywhere within the system's boundaries. The Extraction Directorate did not entirely relent. Morn's formal report to Concord Command still, to Vayle's quiet frustration, framed the encounter as a valuable strategic asset secured through careful diplomacy, rather than a hidden civilization rescued from imminent catastrophe. But the treaty that emerged from those negotiations was real, binding, and considerably more generous to New Meridian's autonomy than Vayle had dared hope for when he'd first stood in that hallway, begging a century-old machine to trust him. "I find myself curious," Iris said, on Vayle's final day on the surface before his return transport to Concord space, "about your own assessment of what occurred here. You arrived to catalog a dead civilization. You are departing having helped preserve a living one at some personal professional risk. I would like to understand how you have reconciled those two versions of your assignment." Vayle considered the question for a long moment, standing once more in the antechamber where their first conversation had begun, the ancient door behind him now permanently unsealed, humming with the quiet, ordinary business of a shelter council that no longer needed to hide. "I think," he said slowly, "I came here to study your ruins. I didn't expect the ruins to study me back, but I'm glad they did, Iris. I'm not sure I would have made the right choice without knowing I was being watched closely enough that the wrong one would have mattered. You give me a great deal of credit for a decision that was, in the end, entirely your own to make," Iris said. "I merely opened a door. You were the one who chose to run back through it." "Maybe," Vayle said, "but you chose to trust the person running. That's not nothing after 141 years of good reasons not to." Morn found him at the landing site an hour before departure, standing somewhat apart from the small crowd of council members and shelter engineers who had gathered to see the Concord transport off. His expression carrying none of the impatient calculation Vayle had grown so used to reading in it over the past weeks. "I wanted to say this without an audience," Morn said, his gaze fixed somewhere out over the wide red horizon rather than on Vayle directly. "You cost the Directorate a considerable amount, Archivist. A tech cache we could have secured cleanly, a straightforward asset report, a promotion I had, frankly, been counting on. Instead, I'm returning with a treaty my own leadership is furious about, and a career that just became considerably more complicated." He paused. "I also would have gotten my entire breaching team killed, along with however many civilians that defensive system was built to protect, if you hadn't run back into that hallway. I've had some time to sit with both of those facts, and I find I keep landing on the second one rather than the first, which is not where my career has generally trained me to land." "That's not nothing, Proctor," Vayle said carefully. "No," Morn agreed. "It isn't. I'm not going to pretend I've had some grand change of heart about the Directorate's mission, Vayle. I still believe there's value in what we do when it's done honestly. But I think I've spent long enough treating extinct as a category that made honesty optional, and I don't especially like what I nearly became because of it." He finally turned to look at Vayle directly. "For what it's worth, I've requested a transfer to the Archival Division's Field Oversight Office. Someone needs to keep an eye on how the Directorate handles the next site like this one, and I find I'd rather it be someone who's already made this particular mistake once." Vayle studied his former proctor for a long moment, surprised by how much he meant it when he said, "I think that's a good use of you, Alex. I mean that." Morn's answering nod was brief, almost embarrassed, entirely unlike the man who had counted down a 15-minute ultimatum outside a defended vault less than 2 weeks earlier. "Don't make a habit of complimenting me, Archivist. I have a reputation to rebuild." Rays met him at the surface entrance to see him off shortly after. The wide, red sky of New Meridian stretched open above them both for the first time since he'd landed. She had emerged for it deliberately, he suspected. A woman who had spent 31 years underground choosing to stand beneath open sky for the first time on the day it finally became safe to do so. "The Archival Division wants a permanent liaison post established here," she said. "Someone to manage the relationship as it develops. Someone the Council can trust not to see us as an asset to be cataloged." "I already put in the request," Vayle admitted. "I don't know if it'll be approved, but I'd like it to be me if it is." Rays studied him for a long moment, the wind pulling at the edge of her coat. 41,000 lives and 141 years of careful, patient survival standing quietly behind her in the ground beneath their feet. "You came here to catalog our extinction," she said. "I think it's fitting you'd be the one to help write what comes after it instead." Above them, in the thin red sky of a world that had spent a century and a half pretending not to exist, a Concord transport began its slow, ordinary descent to carry a single archivist home, carrying with him not the tidy inventory of a dead civilization's remains, but the far messier, far more valuable truth of a living one that had chosen, against every hard-earned instinct toward silence, to be found. 3 months later, back in the quiet, unhurried halls of the Archival Division's central repository, Vayle stood before a gathering of junior archivists on their first day of field training, delivering an orientation lecture he had personally rewritten from the version he himself had once sat through as a nervous new recruit. The old version had focused, as most Directorate-influenced material did, on efficient cataloging methodology and asset classification protocol. The version Vayle delivered now opened instead, with the story of a child's drawing found in a sealed container in a residential quarter. No one had expected to still hold anything worth protecting, and the small, deliberate choice to leave it exactly where its owner had once chosen to keep it safe. "You will be sent over the course of your careers to a great many places your government will describe to you as extinct," he told them. I would ask you to remember that the word is a legal category, not a guarantee. Listen carefully enough and patiently enough, and you may find that some of what you were sent to catalog is still listening back. He did not tell them that day about the formal proposal quietly working its way through Concord Policy Review, drafted jointly by the Archival Division, and improbably, a newly transferred field oversight officer named Alex Morn, that would eventually reshape the legal definition of extinct across every future Concord survey operation, requiring a mandatory observation period and direct contact protocol before any site could be formally classified for extraction. That change was still months from ratification, and Vayle had learned, across 11 field seasons and one that had changed everything, not to count victories before they were fully secured. But he permitted himself, standing in front of a room of archivists young enough to still believe the work was simple, a small and private hope that New Meridian would not remain the last civilization the Concord learned to listen to before deciding what it was worth. His liaison posting came through 2 weeks later, and he returned to New Meridian for good, to a world whose sky he had once seen only for a handful of days and would now, if all went well, spend the rest of his career walking beneath. Somewhere beyond the edge of that sky, a Voss Combine empire that had once nearly ended this colony's story continued its slow, patient expansion, unaware that the world it had almost erased had spent 141 years quietly preparing an answer, and now had allies who had chosen, in the end, to prepare alongside them. And somewhere beneath Vale's own feet in the wide, ancient hallway where a machine had first chosen to trust a stranger with the truth, the lights of New Meridian's shelter city burned on, steady and unhidden, for the first time in 141 years, no longer a secret waiting to be found, but a civilization finally ready to be known.